Okay, welcome everybody. As I said, this is a little bit of a different style share. I've done this as a PowerPoint. I'm sharing the PowerPoint with you. There are no pre-sent out sources. Everything's in the PowerPoint. I will, B'ezrat Hashem, make the entire PowerPoint available to Torah in Motion for afterwards. So it'll be both on the website, and if anybody wants to get it, they can. It was just easier for me not to worry about a source page before setting this up. Okay, the topic that I've chosen is L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim B'Haggadah Shel Pesach, the phrase L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, as it appears in the Haggadah, both in Hebrew and in English, and I'm going to explain that distinction momentarily. This shir, for context, was the very last Shabbat HaGadol shir I gave in my previous pulpit in St. Louis before we made Aliyah. And so I chose the topic then specifically because from the research and from the context, it certainly had a focus about going to Israel, and that's what I was trying to convey. As it turns out, this year, when they asked me to give a shir, I realized that there's nothing more appropriate than giving a shir about the yearning for going to Israel, especially considering the fact that I'm delivering this shir in Israel, in Beit Shemesh, from within our mamad, so that in case there's a siren, I don't have to interrupt the shir, I can continue to teach. And so there's a certain kind of, on the one hand, the challenge of being in Israel at this time, but also the privilege and the unique opportunity and the unique power of being in Israel at this time, which I hope to convey through this shir. So it is not only less appropriate, it's even more appropriate than it was last year. So that's the topic at hand, and I want to divide the shir into two parts. The first half of the shir will focus on the English phrase, next year in Jerusalem, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. And the second half will deal with the phrase in Hebrew and as it appears in Haggadah. When I first started to research this topic, I thought it was a relatively simple, straightforward L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. We say it in the liturgy, we say it twice a year, once at the end of Yom Kippur, once at the end of the Haggadah. And it's kind of just a phrase that is part of Jewish life for centuries and millennia. As I started to research it, I discovered all kinds of fascinating pieces of history that make nothing obvious about the phrase in English or in Hebrew. And the English half of the phrase was based on an article that I found by Professor Sarna about the phrase next year in Jerusalem in English Haggadot in America. And I'll share with you the summary of that research that appears in that article, along with the cross-reference. And that led me to the search for the Hebrew phrase, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, and its origins and what it means in the Haggadah. So we're going to delve right in. Hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint as it comes. Okay, so we're going to start with the question of next year in Jerusalem. Professor Jonathan Sarna from Brandeis University published an article in 2024 entitled The Transformation of Next Year in Jerusalem in the Post-War Haggadah 2024, meaning that's the year that it was published, the post-war American Haggadah. And I found it fascinating because nothing we assume is taken for granted. If I were to ask you to translate the phrase L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, I think you would naturally just roll off the tongue. Translate L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Not so straightforward. This is the very first American printed Haggadah. It was printed in 1837. We'll come back to the year at the end of this year. It's entitled, and it's a very long title, Service for the Two First Nights of the Passover in Hebrew and English. Oh, oops, sorry about that. In Hebrew and English, translated into English, custom of the German and Spanish Jews. Everybody see that? Still with me on the power? Okay. First American edition published in 1837 or 5597, published and printed by Samuel Jackson. Seder Haggadah Pesach, fairly straightforward. In this Haggadah, there is the traditional phrase, the Shana Bab Yushalayim. Remember, this is the first Haggadah printed in English, with an English translation in America. The Shana Bab Yushalayim. But its translation is not at all what we would assume. The phrase in Hebrew, the Shana Bab Yushalayim, is translated into English as the year that approaches, O bring us to Jerusalem. Oh, bring us to Jerusalem is not quite the same as next year in Jerusalem. There's a certain distance that is reflected in that phrase, as if the onus is on God, not on us. We're here, wherever we may be. God, bring us to Jerusalem. And that's the theme that Professor Sarna identifies in a series of Haggadot, all of which revolve around this idea that in the early years of English translations of the Haggadah, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a fear amongst the community in the English-speaking world not to appear disloyal or not to appear to have dual loyalties in terms of our identity. And so, L'Shana Bab Yushalayim has this ambivalence, oh, bring us to Jerusalem. It's placed in the Seder we'll talk about in a few moments.
So I want to ask you, people who are living in Jerusalem,
in the 1800s, there aren't that many, and L'Shana Bab Yushalayim Habnuya is a phrase that hasn't yet come into the vernacular. We'll see where the phrase comes from and why it enters into the Haggadah. I'll answer your question. And so Professor Sarna wrote this article, essentially. This is the title of the article, The Transformation of Next Year in Jerusalem in the Post-War American Haggadah, in which he says that for just over a century, the English language phrase, next year in Jerusalem, appeared in no known American Haggadah. The Hebrew L'Shana Bab Yushalayim most often did appear, even sometimes in bold text, but its standard, widely known translation remained taboo. And that fascinated me, the notion that you couldn't translate L'Shana Bab Yushalayim literally because of the fear that you would be perceived as being disloyal or to having dual loyalties. As another example, the most widely distributed Haggadah probably in history, if certainly not in American history, is the Maxwell House Haggadah. Maxwell House Haggadah is a story unto itself. Why Maxwell House Coffee took it to translate the Haggadah and provide it free of charge to anybody who bought coffee at that time. Has a lot to do with the question of kitniot and the status of coffee on Pesach. Whole story into itself. There's some articles written about it, but it's certainly the most widely distributed Haggadah in history. It's changed over the years. This was the 1932 edition. 1932 edition clearly has L'Shana Bab Yushalayim in the Hebrew. However, the text in English reads, the following year, grant us to be in Jerusalem. Again, it's that gesture to God will bring us to Jerusalem, rather than a call to move to Jerusalem. It's kind of a distancing from the phrase. It appears in the Hebrew. It's in English, it has this kind of very eschatological, like one day God will bring us all to Jerusalem on flying carpets. And that's the theme. That's the sequence of the Haggadot. Professor Sarna in his article also makes reference to the fact that in 1941, the Mordechai Kaplan, founder of the Reconstructionist movement, it also translated a Haggadah and entitled The New Haggadah for the Pesach Seder. And there too, L'Shana Bab Yushalayim appears in the Hebrew. But when it comes to the English translation, may the coming year witness the rebuilding of Zion and the redemption of Israel. Yeah, there's no reference even to Yerushalayim. It's a completely different translation. And so Professor Sarna's conclusion, which is really powerful, is that Orthodox and non-Orthodox thus agreed next year in Jerusalem was too dangerous a sentiment for a Haggadah to express in the vernacular. We take it for granted. Next year in Jerusalem, not so simple. Certainly not in the late 1800s, certainly not in the early 1900s. This taboo is broken, more or less, as Israel becomes stronger and a more significant dominant force in modern history, but particularly in 1934. What happened in 1934? 1934, in the United Kingdom, London Cincinnati Press published a Haggadah translated by Cecil Roth, who was a young Jewish Zionist activist. Whoops, well, what happened to my share? Where did I go?
We can still see.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
We can see.
Yeah, was a young Jewish writer, a Zionist, and included in it was drawings, beautiful drawings by also by an artist by Mabdanya Nachshon, who became known as the Roth Nachshon Haggadah. And here, for the first time, there's an embrace in the Haggadah, in the English side of it, to take a real hold on Zionism, as if to embrace it full on. And you get the sense of what it means, what Zionism has done to the psychology of the people. And here in Yeshana Bab Yerushalayim is clearly marked next to in Jerusalem in the traditional language that we are familiar with it. This is really the first time it appears in this kind of print. Not only that, the whole Haggadah is built around a Zionistic motif. You can see here a family in Israel, a kind of a chalutz, kibbutz type of family celebrating the Shana Bab Yerushalayim. And this is the picture in the opening cover. If you open up the Haggadah and you see the cover page picture has this journey from Europe to Yerushalayim, a very political statement. You sort of get a sense of the dress, the look of Eastern European Jewry as it merges, as it migrates to Israel, and the transformation that just the look of just has as they enter into, and they come sort of dressed as kibbutznikim entering Yerushalayim. It's a whole different approach. This Haggadah essentially breaks the taboo, or is one of the series of Haggadah that breaks the taboo. And suddenly next year in Jerusalem, 1934, early 1940s, establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, suddenly it is no longer taboo to talk about next year in Jerusalem. Similarly, and then I'm going to run through a couple of Haggadot that were very famous, published at that time. This was a Haggadah published by the Jewish Welfare Board in 1943. It was written and translated by Rabbi David and Tamar de Solopul. It's called the de Solopul Haggadah. And there's a very beautiful letter written by the Jewish Welfare Board as kind of an introduction, in which it says that the Haggadah contains the joyous ritual of instruction. This is distributed to the armed forces in 1943, to everybody it was in the army, in the war battling against Nazism. The Haggadah contains the joyous ritual of instruction, worship, and song through which Israel has ever celebrated its exodus from bondage to freedom. Though that exodus occurred over 3,000 years ago, no memory is more strongly embedded in the Jewish consciousness than the story here told and lived anew in every generation. The Passover festival of freedom has never been observed more poignantly than today, 1943, when we are struggling to preserve freedom for man. The United States is a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The Jewish men in its armed forces find doubled inspiration in the time-hallowed recital of the traditional Haggadah. It is to them that is dedicated to this volume of beloved and familiar Hebrew with its interpretive English translation. May it bring them together with sweet associations of home and earth, the renewed thrill and the indomitable strength born of that ideal of liberty, which lives so intensely in every fiber of the American Jew. Committee of Army and Navy Religious Activities Jewish Welfare Board. And that is really a significant publication. You can sense its Zionistic bend and reference. So, for example, Lashon Haba B'Yerushalayim is clearly in this Haggadah translated in the normal next year in Jerusalem. But now, think about it from this perspective. Next year in Jerusalem as a phrase has been published by the United States government. It's a Haggadah published by the Jewish Welfare Board. And that's essentially Sinai's conclusion. If members of the armed forces of the United States could officially celebrate Passover with Haggadah proclaiming next year in Jerusalem, the exclamation's admissibility could scarcely be doubted. And so more or less 100 years from the publication of the first Haggadah, in which you couldn't utter the words in English next year in Jerusalem, published by the United States government next year in Jerusalem is part of the vernacular, part of the language of the Haggadah that we just take for granted. In this Haggadah as well, there's a couple of interesting pieces of trivia. One is that it has the full text of the original version of HaTikvah, which is before the establishment of the State of Israel. There's a couple of lines here that are different than the HaTikvah we are familiar with. Very different conclusion, and there's a second paragraph to it. And on top of that, this Haggadah also published the Star-Spangled Banner, all 3 stanzas, as well as My Country 'Tis of Thee. So you get the sense that it's both reflecting next year in Jerusalem with all that it represents, together with a sense of the loyalty and the American pride that is reflected. This is, after all, publication of the Jewish Welfare Board. 1949, from this trace of the history of the Zionistic tone to the phrase next year in Jerusalem, 1949 is a watershed year. It's the first year post the establishment of the State of Israel. Haggadot are published in schools for education, and so now it's sort of everywhere. But this particular Haggadah, called the Regelson-Schulsinger Haggadah, very, very powerful messaging in this regard. The translation of Haggadah was written by Abraham Regelson, and this is in Sinai's article. If you read the article, you'll see a lot of this first half of this presentation. And he was an immigrant from Belarus. He studied Hebrew and poetry and mysticism. He lived in what was then Palestine in 1933. For a brief period of time, came back to America. Then he returned to Israel permanently in 1949. There is the publisher is Michael Schulsinger. That's why it's called the Regelson-Schulsinger Haggadah. He lived in Israel until 1928, and then he moved to New York and built a publishing house, Schulsinger Brothers Press. And then there's illustrations, and the illustrations are the most fascinating part of this Haggadah. The illustrations were drawn by Sigmund Forst, an artist from Vienna who came to New York after Kristallnacht. And all of his drawings in this Haggadah focus on this extraordinary Zionistic theme. And so you get the kibbutznikim working in the fields, women tilling the soil. You'll get on the page with the piyutim of Kila Na'en, Kila Ya'en, Adi B'Melucha, and Cham Yodea. You get pictures such as the Haganah guard protecting Israel, the farmer wearing talis and tefillin, the top guard tower with the flag of Israel fluttering in the background. These are the pictures that are scattered throughout the Haggadah, including at the very back page. Instead of where normally you would print the HaTikvah, in this Haggadah is published the text of the Declaration of the State of Israel, Declaration of Independence. And that's the motif of this Haggadah. By 1949, this is already in full view. I'm going to run through some of the other Haggadot that Sana mentions. One is the Birnbaum Haggadah. Philip Birnbaum published, so we're all familiar with the Birnbaum Siddur. 1953 was the publication of the Birnbaum Haggadah. What made his publications unique was his trademark feature of no variations in type size. Every letter, every word is typed. Many Siddurim had large print and small print, and in the Birnbaum Siddurim, everything's at the same size. That was sort of the uniqueness of his Haggadah, of his Siddurim. And in this Haggadah, clearly there is Nirtza, and you have Chasal Siddur Pesach, and you have Lashon Haba Yerushalayim. And you have next year in Jerusalem, same as all the other Haggadahs. At this point, it's not considered a Chiddush. What is a Chiddush is that in addition to Lashon Haba Yerushalayim and next year in Jerusalem, Rambam put something else into his Haggadah that hasn't yet been in previous Haggadahs. You're talking about next year in Jerusalem, so let's put in a poem about Yerushalayim. And so he published on the page with Hatikva the words of the poem Me'al Piskat Harat Sofrim, a poem written by an Israeli poet, Avigdor Hameiri, and then made famous, of course, because Yoram Gaon sings it as a song. And so now suddenly this has been embraced in the Haggadah world as well. Without question, the most Zionistic Haggadah published in that period of time was which was the one published by Menachem Kasher. Menachem Kasher, author and publisher of the Torah Shlema, Medrash on Chumash. He published a Haggadah called Haggadat Pesach Eretz Yisraelit. And 1950, this already is a fully Zionistic Haggadah. It includes a whole section on the sources of the state of Israel, Al Pi Halacha, a whole section devoted to the notion that this establishment of the state of Israel is at Chaltut Gula, the beginning of the redemption. And what's interesting is he even translates this Zionistic pride into a strong advocacy for drinking the fifth cup. The whole story, the fifth cup is the fifth expression of redemption, the Heveti, to come to the land of Israel. The four cups corresponding to the four expressions of redemption up until leaving Egypt, up until and stop right before the expression of coming to the land of Israel, Heveti al Haaretz. And so he advocated for the drinking of a fifth cup. He has a very beautiful motif in photos that reflect this kind of a drawing of the four cups and all the themes related to four that are part of the Haggadah. The four cups are reminiscent of the four empires that enslaved Israel, from which we were redeemed. And so you have, I don't know if you can see it. I don't know if I can zoom in so easily. Oops, where did I go? Where did I go? I'm trying to zoom in and it's not working. Okay, let's try this. Is that better? Does it zoom in at your end? No, it doesn't zoom in. Does it zoom in at your end? I don't know.
Yes.
It seems pretty big, yeah.
All right, so if you look at the pictures, you'll see there are identification of each of the cups. There are the four expressions of redemption, V'tzeti, V'tzalti, V'kalti, V'lakachti. The names of the four exiles, Mitzrayim, Bavel, Paras, Yavan. He includes the four mitzvot that are reflections of the number four corners of the Arba Tzitziot, Tefillin, Arba Minim, four Rosh Hashanahs. But then, in that same context, he writes, the second illustration presents the fifth cup, and it represents the beginning of the current redemption, which we are privileged to look upon in these days, as our exiles are brought and flown from all corners of the world to the land of Israel to reestablish the ancient glories of our people. And he advocated strongly for drinking a fifth cup for Veheveti. And that fifth cup, and you can see the motif. Here you have the land of Israel and coming to the land of Israel by boat and by plane. And this is now a full-blown embrace of modern Israel as a part of the redemption story of our people. What started in Mitzrayim, went through the exile of 4 exiles through history, has now become part of the modern story, has become part of that ancient story. And I think if I would be remiss if I didn't conclude this discussion of the phrase next year in Jerusalem with probably the context in which the phrase earned its greatest notoriety and greatest publicity and greatest fame. And that is Natan Sharansky. Post 1967, the notion of next year in Jerusalem became the slogan of the Soviet Jewry movement, and nothing made more famous than by Sharansky's closing remarks at his trial, in which he was given the right for final statement, and so he says to the court, in my final words, I turn to my wife Avital and to all of those people who supported me for more than 2,000 years. The Jewish people have been dispersed wherever they were. Jews, wherever they were, repeated the phrase, next year in Jerusalem. Now when I am further than ever from my people, from Avital, facing many arduous years of imprisonment, I say to the turning to my people and my Avital, next year in Jerusalem. Then he writes, then you said, now I turn to you, the court, who are required to confirm a predetermined sentence. To you, I have nothing to say. A famous quote from Sharansky. But that really turned the phrase next year in Jerusalem into the slogan of the Soviet Jewry movement. And all of this really reflects the conclusion of the first half of the shir, which is that the way in next year in Jerusalem was the way the phrase L'Shana Abba B'Yerushalayim was understood, both in the fear of it in the 1800s and in the embrace of it in the middle of the 20th century up until today, was to see it as a physical call to return to the land of Israel and to the people of Israel and to the city of Yerushalayim, the notion of redemption physically to bring the people to the land. That's what made it fearful in the 1800s, and that's what made it identified with modern Aliyah and the return to Israel physically in the story of modern Zionism in the latter part of the 20th century. So the question I want to start with is, as we move from part 1 to part 2, is what is the story to the Hebrew phrase, L'Shana Abba B'Yerushalayim? Is that what it means? Is it always meant to physically return to the land of Israel, or did it in its original context have a different meaning in a different context? And part of that question is, when does this phrase get invented? When does it get coined? What's the early reference to this phrase? What earliest reference we have to the phrase in Hebrew, L'Shana Abba B'Yerushalayim? And that's fascinating. That part of the research led me down an eye-opening revelation, to me at least. And that's what I want to share with you. So I want to start with a simple reference, which is a halachic source, 13th century halachic source, the Shibbolei Halakhet, one of the foundational sources in halacha of Tzedekah ben Avraham Harofei. He was born in Rome, studied in Germany. I've given you a little bit of the bios of each of the halachic sources that I quote, so you get a sense of where they lived and when they lived. This is right the heart of the 13th century. And the Shibbolei Halakhet writes with regards to this phrase, and he following. In the beginning of Haggadah, we have a paragraph, Halach Ma'anya, all familiar with it. It talks about bread of affliction. We talk about this year we're slaves, next year we're free men, this year we're here, next year we're in the land of Israel. This year we are here, next year we are in Israel, hopefully as free men. Yesh mefarshim, there are those who suggest, after we mention the Pesach, meaning the Paschal offering, which we don't have today because we're in exile, So we are in exile, we are slaves in exile. We can't bring the Paschal offering appropriately. However, we have a sense of comfort. We have this promise that God will redeem us and will take us out of our exile and will bring us to the land of Israel. And that's, we say it in the davening every day. We say it as part of we talk about returning to Zion, we talk about Shivei Shofteinu, we talk about Kametz Nefutzateinu, we talk about bringing our exiles back to the land of Israel. It's all part of this redemption process. Then he adds the following: Yehi ratzon lefanecha Hashem Elokeinu, may it be your will, God, lekayem lanu avtachato, that God should fulfill this promise. B'shana zot, even in this year, shenaseh Pesach shel shana haba'ah b'Yerushalayim. That we should be able to fulfill the Paschal, bring the Paschal offering in Yerushalayim. You get a sense that if he was given the phrase L'shana Haba b'Yerushalayim, whether he had the phrase or didn't have the phrase, we'll see where it starts, but his understanding of L'shana Haba b'Yerushalayim would be reflected in this idea of a hope to bring the Korban Pesach. Part of our exile, we are in exile. And next year we will be redeemed. L'shana haba b'Arad Yisrael, next year in the land of Israel, next year in Yerushalayim. And the two themes are interconnected. And the two phrases are interconnected. One, right, at the beginning of the Haggadah, which answers the question why L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim in the Haggadah is not at the beginning. Why isn't it here in the first half of the Haggadah? But that's how he seems to understand the dream of Yerushalayim in the Haggadah as a function of fulfillment of the Korban Pesach. And that would put it in the broader canvas of all of the tefillot related to exile and redemption. Here's the mystery. We have a host of literature. We have Mishnah, we have Yerushalmi, we have a Babli, we have Medrash, we have the halachic literature of the Gaonim, we have the Nusach of the Haggadah of the Rambam, we have a whole host of literature that spans 1,000 years plus. More than that, almost 1,500 years. The first reference to the phrase L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, the earliest reference to the coinage, the language, next year into the dream, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, is not on the Mishnah. You won't find it in the Mishnah. The phrase, you can do a search. You can go through the databases, whether it be online databases or the Bar-Ilan database. You can search. You'll see. It's nowhere to be found in the Jerusalem Talmud. It's nowhere to be found in the Talmud Bavli. It's nowhere to be found in the entire literature of the Medrash. It's nowhere to be found in all the literature of the Gaonim. And goes without saying, you won't find it in the language of the Haggadah and the Rambam. In other words, if we really unravel the layers of history, Sharansky had one inaccuracy in his statement. He said, ever since, for 2,000 years, we've uttered these words, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. It's a fast. The phrase, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, in its coined language, in that language, doesn't appear for the first 2,000, all the literature from the time of the Mishnah up until the Middle Ages. So when we start to look for where this phrase first appears, it will also tell us a great deal about what the phrase meant to the original coined language of the phrase and how and why it enters the Haggadah. That's the story that I wanted to share in the second half of today's share. In fact, the closest and earliest reference we have is in this tefillah written in the 10th century. There's in the 10th, 11th, 12th century, in the time of the Paitanim in Spain and in other places, there was a series of tefillot that were composed They were called yotzrot or kravot. There were different additional tefillot that were composed to be recited at various times in the daven. Most places today don't recite them. Some places still do. So this was a yotze, meaning it was a tefillah comprised to be said in addition as part of Birchas Kriyat Shema in the morning, as part of Shachris, to be recited on Shabbos HaGadol. It was written in the 10th century by Yosef ibn Abitur. And each line of this yotze, each line of this tefillah, ends with a pasuk. Takif kechashtin fatimanit, very poetic language. I'm not going to go through the Hebrew because it'll take us too long. But you can see in English, with strength like a mighty one, he will strike with a right hand wave. He will gather his scattered ones from those who prolong the affliction. And then he ends with the pasuk. Ken Yosef Hashem Yado Shenit. Ken Yosef Hashem Yado Shenit is a direct reference to a pasuk in Yeshayahu. In Yeshayahu it says, and he talks about the redemption, he talks about the ingathering of the exiles. Yosef Hashem Shenit Yado Liknot Shari Moshe Yashem Yashum Mitzrayim Mipatos Mikush Me'elam Mishem, etc. God will again return to cover the remnants of his people and bring them to the land of Israel from all the four corners of the earth. That's the first verse in which he ends. The next paragraph, these are the last three paragraphs of this tefillah. The pure of heart hope for his greatness. He will lead them to the dwelling of the sanctuary in song. There the house of Israel shall serve him altogether. That too is a pasuk. The pasuk is in Yechezkel. Ki bahar kodshi bahar merom Yisrael nu'um Hashem Elokim sham ya'avduni kol beit Yisrael kulo ba'aretz sham ertzem. There I will desire. There they will serve me in the land. There they will. I will desire their service. Sham edrosh tumatechem. There I will take their offerings. So both these references from Yeshayahu and from Yechezkel are clear references to the idea of physically returning to the land of Israel, part of that redemption process. The last paragraph of this yotze does something very interesting. Talum yad mufla'a, v'sameach na'ala'a, a wondrous hand shall be raised to gladden a weary nation, b'Yerushalayim l'shana haba, to Jerusalem the next year. That's the closest we have in the earliest formation. It's not yet that coined phrase l'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. It's backwards, b'Yerushalayim l'shana haba. But it's also the only paragraph in this yotze that doesn't end with a pasuk, doesn't end with a verse. It ends with a tefillah that essentially is parallel to all of these verses, that we should return to Yerushalayim. And so that's the first hint that the phrase B'Yerushalayim l'shana haba is not about the Korban Pesach or about it's about the physical return, part of the redemption process of Kibbutz Goliot, Yosef Hashem Shenit Yado, to bring us back from all the lands. God will return us to the land of Israel. Still quite not the phrase L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, but we're getting closer. We're in the 10th century. The 11th century brings us to a poem also written as one of these additional liturgical poems to be added to the holiday tefillot. In this case, it's about Yom Kippur. It's written by Yitzchak ben Yehuda ibn Gayat, 11th century. And this tefillah is referred to as a krova, part of the tefillah of Kedusha, and it is written specifically for Ne'ilah. So it's not about Pesach at all. It's about Ne'ilah. And according to the Mata Ephraim, that's one of the reasons why we say L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim at Ne'ilah time, because this prayer composed by Yitzchak ibn Ga'at is in fact the very first place we find the phrase L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim in line 15 of this tefillah. This is its origin. As near as anybody can tell, the first time this phrase appears in its format, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, is here in this tefillah written for Ne'ilah, which most places don't say, in the 11th century. And at that point, the phrase has never existed. This is its first coinage. But it picks up energy, right? That's 10th century B'Yushalayim L'Shana Haba, 11th century L'Shana Haba B'Yushalayim, in an obscure tefillah, poetically written as one of the additional tefillot of the day. Up until this point, it's been nowhere. This is its first reference. When does it enter the Haggadah? That was the question I was exploring. When does it enter the Haggadah? And so I want to introduce you to the strangest Haggadah ever printed. What is the strangest Haggadah ever printed? The strangest Haggadah ever printed is called the Bird's Head Haggadah. I want to ask for a show of hands how many people have ever heard of the Bird's Head Haggadah. Early, circa 1300, in Germany, manuscript of a Haggadah. In those days, they were written by the Haggadot that were printed, were hand manuscripts, right? This is before printing. The pictures are all painted in color. Each copy of this manuscript had to be done by hand. There exists one copy of this manuscript left in the world. I don't remember who owns it. I think it was bought by one of the museums, but it exists. And this is called the Bird's Head Haggadah. Bird's Head Haggadah is a fascinating story. And you can see here, I'm going to show you closer pictures of this Haggadah in a moment. It has a fascinating history to it. If you look up Wikipedia and you look up the Bird's Head Haggadah, you can see pictures. Here are the pictures. All of these individuals with what look like birds' heads, meaning they have human features except that their noses are and mouths are depicted as beaks, like birds. And some of them are wearing, you can see all the features are mammalian or human features. They have these pointed hats. All of this reflects or seems to reflect the kind of Christian culture in the 13th century and how the Jews were perceived in that arena. And that's what, if you look up the Wikipedia article on the Bird's Head Haggadah, that's what it describes. The oldest surviving illuminated Ashkenazi Passover Haggadah, Jewish characters are dressed in medieval German Jewish clothing, the pointed Jewish hat mandated by the church, 13th century is seen on Jewish leaders. Yet while the Jewish characters all have human bodies, and some have human hair and beards and wear helmets or snoods, their faces are those of sharp-beaked and sharp-eyed birds. Large beak occupies the place where the nose and mouth should be. Faces of non-Jewish characters, there is Paro, there is the Egyptians chasing after the Jews. It's interesting to note, this is Kriyat Yamsuf. This is the Egyptian army chasing after the Israelite army. Anybody notice something odd about this picture? This is the Egyptian army. You can see the normal faces of the Egyptians, the beaks are Jews. Anybody notice something odd about this picture? Not relevant to the L'Shana Haba B'Yushalayim, but just fascinating by itself. There are two.
The Egyptians are in the front.
Well, and in the back.
Correct.
And here's the Egyptian chariots. There are the Egyptian horses. There are two bird-beaked people amongst the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Who are they? If you know the story, they are a depiction of Datan and Aviram, and the rebellious character to be part of the Egyptian army. Okay. Prevalent theory for the use of the bird rather than human faces is the illustrator's attempt to circumvent the Jews' second commandment prohibition against making a graven image in the tradition of Jewish Amiconism. The Bird's Head Haggadah was always perceived with a certain kind of anti-Semitic bent to it. It would have been the sponsors of the Haggadah, which would have been very, very wealthy, maybe Christians who were sponsoring this Haggadah, and it's unclear why it would be preserved, why it would be such a significant effort to depict these what kind of almost very anti-Semitic looking birds. came across a fascinating alternative interpretation of this Haggadah. And I'll explain why I'm so fascinated by this Haggadah in a moment. But there is a professor by the name of Mark Michael Epstein. I don't know who he is personally. If anybody does, let me know. Who wrote a book called Skies of Parchment, Seas of Ink, Jewish Illuminated Manuscripts, published in 2015. He argues, quote, the figures depicted in the Bird's Head Haggadah are not birds, but composite creatures. Even their heads are composite, blending in most cases the beaked profile of a beard with a beard and pointed mammalian ears. One creature in the medieval bestiary is configured in exactly this fashion. For all of you Harry Potter fans out there, that animal is the griffin, a composite of lion and eagle. That's the griffin. Now, the griffin was a noble creature in mythology. And so, if you're not going to depict faces on the Jews, if you were to depict Jewish faces as griffins, that was not a nod to anti-Semitism. That was a nod to the nobility and the power of the people of Israel. And that's what makes this story so interesting. Even more interesting is that this Haggadah, as far as we can tell, is the earliest Haggadah in print, in manuscript form, to include the phrase L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim on its pages. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim enters into the Haggadic text for the first time, and not consistently, but the first earliest reference we have to it in the text of the Haggadah is in this very odd Haggadah called the Bird's Head Haggadah. And it's part of the piyutim, it's part of the song sung at the end of the Haggadah. It's not part of Alach Ma'anya, it's Kila Noah, Kila Yah. It's part of that. It's actually before we drink the fourth cup of wine. And it's part of the songs of redemption that we sing at the end of the Haggadah. So when we start to look at the text and the language in the halachic literature to where this text appears in the Haggadah, that story belongs to the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. From that period of time on, some Haggadot begin to include the phrase L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, some do not. So for example, in Sefer Minhagim, there was a tendency in the 13th through 15th centuries for people to write chronicles of various customs in different lands. Travelers especially, scholars who travel from place to place, and they would record the different minhagim. So, for example, in the 13th century, you have a book called Sefer HaMinhagim of Abba Mechildik, Customs of the Seder Night. He includes L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim as part of the piyutim, Hallel and Hallel Gadol and Nishmat and Mehi B'Chatzi Halayla and B'Martim Zebach Pesach and Kila No, all the songs at the end of Haggadah, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, and then you drink the fourth cup of wine, which is exactly what we saw in the Bird's Head Haggadah. In the 15th century, you have a record by Yitzchak Turnau, who wrote that you drink the fourth cup first, and then you recite L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim and Chasal Siddur Pesach. So there's not a consistency as to where it goes in the Haggadah. It's relatively new in the sequence of the Haggadah, and therefore different customs have put it in different places. But in all cases, it's at the end. It's part of the piyutim and the songs of where the Jewish life would go. And the anticipation for the future, anticipation of redemption of the future, the story that the notion that the Exodus from Egypt isn't just a story of the past, it's also a reflection of our future. In the 15th century, there's a particular reference here, and I want to spend a few minutes in the talk about the 15th century. And we're going to come to a very important source called the Trumat Hadeshen in a moment. This was a source of Maleket Yosha written by a student of the Trumat Hadeshen. And he writes, again, in this notion that a part of the end of the Seder was to record L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, was to say these words, and then afterwards Adirhu and Bakar B'Yameinu, etc. Even the phrase "Chasasi de Pesach Kirchata," by the way, that's a whole different shir. That little paragraph "Chasasi de Pesach" is also not part of the original language of Haggadah. Also part of a tefillah that was recited in Shabbos HaGadol and then entered into the Haggadah at a later time. And so, in the 15th century, this now takes on energy. It's now standard. It's now part of Chasasi de Pesach. It's now part of the Haggadah. 13th, 14th, and the highlight in the 15th century, it's now standard. You will not find an Ashkenazic Haggadah. I don't know about the Sephardic Haggadah because I haven't, that story I haven't read. But in the Ashkenazic world, you will not find a Haggadah that doesn't have the phrase L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim after the 15th century. What happened in the 15th century? Why now? So this source, the Leked Yosher, is in particular important. He was a student of the Trumas Hadeshen. The Trumas Hadeshen, Rav Yisrael Isserlin, again, 15th century. You can get a sense. We just think about the years. 15th century ends in 1492 with the Spanish Inquisition. It's a world in turmoil. The Jewish world is in turmoil. And the tumulting around the status of the Jewish community in the 15th century is particularly powerful. So the Trumas Hadeshen raises the following question. This has nothing to do with Pesach. This is just a reflection of a mindset that's taking place now in the 15th century Jewry in Europe. And why the notion that L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim would speak to this generation, or 2 or 3 centuries of generation, more than previous ones, I think is very powerful. He was asked the following question, and he responded to it. Rabbi Yisrael Isserlin from Germany, he was chief rabbi of Vienna. His bio is here below. He writes, "Umasha katavtu li od me'aliyatcha le'eretz tzvi u'le'ir hakodesh yibaneh b'meher b'yameinu." With regards to your question about making aliyah, so now we have 15th century rabbi, leader, chief rabbi of Vienna, was asked a question by a student or one of his Balbatim, about moving to the land of Israel, about making aliyah. And he was asked, is it a mitzvah now, today, to make aliyah, 15th century, 1400s? Afilu Talmud Chacham, even somebody who's a Torah scholar, if you move to Israel in the 15th century, you're not going to find yeshivas, you're not going to find B'nai Torah, you're not going to find a place to learn. So you're making aliyah because you want to live in the land of Israel. Writes Rav Yisrael Isserlin, Dalacha, Tibivadai Shevach Gadol U'Mala Yesh L'Adam Adar Be'eretz Yisrael. Halabai, what a wonderful schus it is to live in the land of Israel. The Kosh came Be'ir HaKodesh. I'm more so in Yerushalayim, L'To'elet, L'Olam Haba, V'gam L'Olam Hazeh, benefit in the next world, benefit in this world. We know, however, it's hard to find livelihood there, and it's hard to earn profit, hard to run a business. Is it possible to financially survive in this arena? Besides the wickedness of the Ishmaelites who are there and who are causing trouble. 15th century. Maybe a sense of perspective. לכן כל איש יישאר בעצמו בהשגת תקופו וממונו, באיזה דרך יוכל לעמוד ביראת השם ובשימור מצוות, כי זה כל האדם. So each person has to weigh the advantages of going to Israel against the challenges and whether or not he'll be able to remain from and able to learn a livelihood. Okay, each one has to make that assessment. So he doesn't answer the question. He doesn't answer the question that was posed to him. But he does answer the question that's posed to us, namely, what's going on in the heart and soul of Jewry in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, in the 15th century especially, as the Jewish community in Austria and in Germany is going through the tumulting of living in a much more hostile environment than in the past. And they're looking to the land of Israel as a potential solution. And what motif would speak to the heart of that mindset more then this new phrase, and I say new phrase, L'shana Abba B'Yerushalayim. I read this in the article. I read this in an article, linked this tshuva of the Trumas Hadeshen to a very contemporary source. This is a letter written, famous letter written by Isaac Tzarfati, who lived in Turkey. He was originally from Germany, I believe. Lived in Turkey, and he wrote a letter to the Jews of Austria and Germany in 1454, middle of the 15th century. We've heard of the afflictions more bitter than death that have befallen our brethren in Germany, the tyrannical Jews, the compulsory baptism and the banishments, which are of daily occurrence. I am told that when they flee from one place to a yet harder fate befalls them in another. I hear an insolent people raising its voice in fury against the faithful remnant living amongst them. I see its hand uplifted to smite my brethren. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. On all sides, I learn of anguish of soul and torment of body, of daily exactions levied by merciless oppressors. Clergy and the monks, false priests that they are, rise up against the unhappy people of God and say, let us pursue them unto destruction. Let the name of Israel be no more known amongst men. That's what he's hearing the Jews in Europe in the 15th century are experiencing. They have made law that every Jew found upon a Christian ship bound for the East should be flung into the sea. Alas, how evil are the people of God in Germany entreated. How sadly is their strength departed. They are driven hither and thither, and they are pursued even unto death. The sword of the oppressor hangs over their heads, and they are flung unto the devouring flames, into swift flowing rivers, and into the foul and into foul swamps. Now, this is the paragraph that I find so fascinating, and how so dramatically how history has changed so dramatically. Brothers and teachers, friends and acquaintances, I, Isaac Tzarfati, though I spring from a French stock, yet was I born in Germany, and sat there at the feet of my esteemed teachers. I proclaim to you that Turkey is a land wherein nothing is lacking, and where, if you will, all shall yet be well with you. The way to the Holy Land lies open to you through Turkey. There's not much more you can say, given the world we live in today. And now seeing all these things that we say, wherefore sleepest thou? Arise and leave this accursed land forever. 15th century, that's the call of the hour. That's the heartbeat of the nation. That's the beginning of the yearnings and the pangs for what eventually has now entered into the Haggadah in bold print, L'shana Abba B'Yerushalayim. I want to go, what do we have? Oh, we're out of time. Okay, so very briefly, I'm just going to reference some observations. 15th, 16th century, the beginning to interpret the phrase L'shana Abba B'Yerushalayim. 15th century of Shimon Duran writes, and this is fascinating, that even the first paragraph of Halach Ma'anya is in Aramaic, because that was the language we spoke in Bavel, and therefore it was left in there. However, in the first paragraph of the Haggadah, Halach Ma'anya, there's two lines that are said in Hebrew that are Kadesh Yavinu Atinokot, so that the children will understand them. Because that's what the children say. Our children are speaking German or Yiddish or whatever language they're speaking, but one phrase they say in Hebrew all the time. 15th century, 16th century. Then you have, of course, the story of the Vilna Gaon, and who starts a journey himself to the land of Israel. He doesn't make it, but he sends his students, and the early settlers in Yerushalayim of the Vilna Gaon, students of the Vilna Gaon and students of the Baal Shem Tov in the 18th century, 1700s. Now kind of moving through history quickly. L'shana Abba B'Yerushalayim. And then, of course, this is a contemporary source. I'm going to skip it for now. Basically, to conclude, what it was fascinating to me was, even though Lashon Haba B'Yushalayim has, as the Shibbolei Aleket describes it, this kind of halachic context at the beginning of the Haggadah with the Korban Pesach and the dream and the aspiration to bring the Korban Pesach. Historically, the phrase doesn't exist until the people start to yearn for a physical return to the land. And so Lashon Haba B'Yushalayim, which is born in the language of the Paitanim, in the language of the poetry of the 11th century, 12th century, 13th century, and then enters into the Haggadah and into the vernacular, into the tefillot at the end of the Haggadah, the V'achim B'tziyah Laila, B'matins of Pesach, Kilana, Adiru, all written in that period of time, Kilana in the 13th century, Adiru in the 14th century, all reflect the idea that Pesach's not an old story, Pesach's an ongoing story. Pesach isn't about the redemption of the past alone, it's about the notion of as you were once in Egypt and I took you out of Egypt, I will once again show you great wonders, miracles. Just look around us. In all of the experience that we are having, I'm sitting in a mamad teaching you this, giving you this year, sharing with you these insights, and I'm in a mamad because of what's going on in the world in Israel around us. But what's going on in Israel around us is nothing short of miraculous, extraordinary stories, extraordinary nisim and niflas. That's what Lashon Haba brings us to this moment in history, where it is truly about the yearning to return to the land of Israel. I'm going to conclude this year with two observations that I skipped in the very opening presentation. We talked about the Haggadah that was printed in America in 1837 and it was at that time the phrase Lashon Haba B'Yushalayim, which reflected this idea of our yearning to physically go to Israel, was considered too hot to handle. And so it was retranslated. And now you understand the irony of that translation. To say, God, bring us to Yerushalayim is very different from the 15th century yearning to solve the problems of anti-Semitism by physically going to the land of Israel. It's a different conversation. And so the publishers of this Haggadah understood that in English they had to rephrase the expression Lashon Haba B'Yushalayim so that it didn't reflect that, it didn't state that yearning so clearly. However, the publishers were very clever, and in the Hebrew, they left clues as to what they really meant. What do I mean by that? This Haggadah was published in the year 1837. 1837 is, if you look at it, in the year 5597. 5597 is 1837. You can do the math. Okay. What's interesting is that when we put dates in Hebrew, we often drop the 5,000. We call it the prat katan, or the mispar katan. We drop the 5,000, and so 1837 would be written in Hebrew as Taf Kuf Tzadik Zayin, or 597. Okay? Look at the way the Hebrew date is written in this text. It's published in Tza'ir Shlomo ben Tzvi Hirsch, New York, Shnat Lashana Haba B'Yushalayim Prat Katan. Lashana Haba B'Yushalayim is an interesting, it's the year of Lashana Haba B'Yushalayim. Even though the phrase is too hot to handle in English. In Hebrew, the publishers left a stem, but they spelt it oddly. Right? Haba is spelled with an aleph, there's no hey. Right? Some letters are bold, some letters are big, some letters are small, because this is a gematria. And if you look at the gematria, aleph, yud, resh, shin, vav, shin, lamed, yud, mem, put it together and do the math. 1 plus 10, 206, 330, 10, 40, do the math. Comes to 597. In other words, the publishers wanted to leave us with a message. We may not translate Lashon Haba B'Yushalayim literally, but in the Hebrew, you know our message. This is published in the year Lashon Haba B'Yushalayim. And the final slide that I will share with you, this I found in Professor Seiner's article. is the story of the Seder plate that was distributed by the Joint Distribution Committee in 1948. In 1948, in the spring, DP camps all over Europe, 250,000 Jewish refugees in Germany, Italy, Austria. The JDC provided matzah and wine and Pesach supplies to over 1 million refugees in Europe. And they distributed them on a Seder plate produced specifically for this task. This is the Seder plate. And if you look at it carefully, it says, Me'avdus l'cheres, from slavery to freedom. There's your slavery, there's your freedom. And on the bottom it says, B'shana hazot Yerushalayim. This year in Jerusalem. And that was the message, 1948, to the refugees, 1 million refugees in Europe. The dream, the aspiration that L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim should now become the reality of B'Shana Hazot B'Yerushalayim. So we started with I'm going to stop sharing now for a moment. We started with the story of a translation of a phrase that was too hot to handle in the 1800s because people were afraid of dual loyalties. And we traced its history so that in English, it takes on an energy specifically connected to the development of Zionism and the acceptance of Zionism and the modern state of Israel. In Hebrew, we can trace the phrase as well back to, not all the way back to classic literature, Mishnah, Gemara, Medrash. Its phrase starts in the poetry of the Middle Ages, in the yearning for the physical return to the land of Israel. In the 13th, 14th century, it enters into the Haggadah. By the 15th century, it's full-on part of the Haggadah and part of the songs of redemption that are in that message, the end of the Haggadah. That's the story of L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. I'm going to stop here and open it up for questions. I went a few minutes longer than anticipated. I apologize for that, but hopefully you were able to enjoy the phrase.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Really great.
Hag Sameach.
After Pesach, we shall return to a normal scheduled program of Sefer Shoftim in this time slot. If you're not part of our study of Sefer Shoftim, you're welcome to join us. If you are, then we will see you after Pesach on our regular time slot.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Rabbi, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, just wondering, how does living in Israel affect your phrasing of the L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, Abnuya,
Right.
Hazot?
So that's really the interesting question. When you see it in the context of how it was intended originally, then it's sort of a tefillah fulfilled, if you will, right? If the idea was L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim physically to come back to living in Israel, then it's almost as if it's been fulfilled, and which is why in many places in Israel, and really everywhere in the world, it's kind of been the tag on to L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim Habnuya has been added to it, because that already talks about or implies the notion of the Beit HaMikdash and the Korban Pesach, etc., sort of the next stage of our story. But in its original conception, I think much of it is a dream fulfilled. And so L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim now takes on what was originally what the Shibbolei Leket thought was the original intention was, which was the Korban Pesach and the Beit HaMikdash and the final steps of redemption. But in its history, if you trace it, it really is about the dream fulfilled that we are living in our generation.
Okay, thank you. So that, as a follow-up, so do we change it to Hazot? What is the future? Why only next year? Why not now?
You could change it if you wanted to, or you could add the add-on of Habniyah, which would refer to the Beit HaMikdash, and so that would still be the next step of the dream.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent.
I think it's particularly interesting that the fifth cup is fulfilled Heveti by Eliyahu Hanavi drinking it.
Okay, so there's a little bit of history there. The fifth cup is not really the cup for Eliyahu to drink. The fifth cup is a machloket in the Rishonim. Do we drink it or we don't drink it? It has nothing to do with Eliyahu. It's just that we have machloket whether we drink the fifth cup or we have the fifth cup or we don't drink the fifth cup. And so, like many unresolved questions.
But we call it
the Eliyahu. That also is a language that emerged later. Probably because, like so many other questions, we leave for Eliyahu, so to speak, in the Gemara Teku, Tishbi Teretz B'Shot Bayot. So this is also one of those unresolved questions: do you drink a fifth cup or not? So we leave it for Eliyahu to resolve. I don't think Eliyahu drinks the cup. I actually have often said that this is unrelated to this year. I'm after my time, but since we're schmoozing, I've often said that we open up the door for Eliyahu and Navi. So the classic interpretation is we pour the fifth cup, we open the door, and we invite Eliyahu to our Seder. And then we say something very odd, which is a tefillah about the exile, about the fact that we're living in a world that is unredeemed. So I've often said that sequence of events is actually backwards. We open up the door because we want to see if the world is redeemed and if Eliyahu has come and if the Mashiach is at the door. Unredeemed. So we close the door and we say Shema Chamas Chal Hagoyim, because we're not there yet. That's a different interpretation. All right. Be well, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Rabbi?
Yes.
We know that those Jews who were not Zionists said, as long as they don't have shmad, we don't return to the land. Was there any pushback on, and those are Ashkenazi, were there any pushback on them on the phrase Lashana Babi Yerushalayim in the 18 or 1900s?
Probably not, because they could have easily have simply interpreted it in the same way we would interpret Allah Ma'anya, which is when Mashiach comes, he'll bring us back to the land of Israel. So it wouldn't have, and again, the history of it was not necessarily known to them. Jewish history has a way of, certainly in the Middle Ages, once you publish things, they kind of all set in one layer. We don't always see the layers and the levels of history behind it. So the same way Sharansky would have said for 1,000 years, for 2,000 years, Jews have said this phrase. They haven't said this phrase for more than 500 years. So I think that it would have been perceived as a kind of a part of that same nod to one day we'll come back and we'll build a Beit HaMikdash when Mashiach brings us there. So I don't think that would have significantly disturbed them.
Oh.
But if you look at the history of it, it's much more about the yearning and the desire to physically go and be there, which they obviously did not necessarily accept.
I heard that Sharansky's daughter published a Haggadah this year.
That I don't know.
Rachel, I think.
Yeah. Yes, it's called the Az Nashir. It's together with
that was
Matan.
published by her? Okay, I've seen that.
Yes, she's with Az Nashir. She and Shira Lakenshefs.
And the other question I had, which isn't directly on topic, when they asked God to bring them to Jerusalem to fulfill the promise, the first part is in the first person and the second part is in the third person. Is that just because they're afraid to confront God too directly about fulfilling his promise?
You're talking about in the English?
No, the Hebrew. When you had, I took screenshots of it. I can find it. But that you should help us fulfill the idea of coming to Jerusalem. That you, Eloheinu, you and then it's to fulfill his promise. So the first part is in first person, second part is in third person.
I know which you are referring to.
Let me see if I can find it quickly. To fulfill the promise, may it be your will, Lord our God, to fulfill his promise. So that when you're talking to Lord our God as first person, to fulfill his promise for us in this is already referring to God in the third person.
Which Haggadah are you referring to?
This was what you put on for Rabbi Tzidkiyahu ben Avraham. That slide. The English and the Hebrew is the same. Yiratzon lefanecha Adonai Elokeinu lekayem lanu haftachato. But so when you're talking to lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu, we're talking to God in the first person. Haftachato is referring to God in the third person. Instead of havatchatcha, your promise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if that source meant it so specifically. I don't know. I'd have to look at which source you're referring to. But it's not an uncommon switch in literature.
Yes, it's Shibolei that your slide there.
We say I've closed that, so talking to pull it back up. But we do that transition from third person to first person to third person all the time. We do it every time we say a bracha.
Yes, but that's more. Can you feel God's presence for a long time? And this
it's not an uncommon transition in the liturgy. I don't know. I'd have to look at the source to see if there's something deeper there. I'm not sure there is.
Okay, thank you. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you. All right, everybody. Laila tov.